Talking of which, I'm now going to introduce you to Phil Gilbank, who is our speaker tonight. I'm really thrilled about this. I've heard you speak twice, Phil, and both times I have been absolutely mesmerised with what you show and what you say. Now, I'd like it if you could tell people about the projects that you are involved with, particularly Burnby Hall, because you'll do it much better than me today, basically. So just a minute or two while we change over the presentations, okay?
I've got something manual in case the technology doesn't work, but I've got that, but I've also brought my North Grimston sword so I can point at things. It's not the actual North Grimston sword. It cost me 46 quid from York Armoury, which I thought wasn't a bad deal, really. So we can do a bit of a waving around. Thank you, Alison, for giving me a big build-up. All right, so does that mean... did I press anything there? Yes. All right. Well, it's working. Yeah, she gave me the big build-up. Why am I here? I'm not sure. What happened last October is I'd been booked by the High Wolds group at Thixondale to give them an update on the proposed Pocklington Museum. I'm the chairman of Pocklington District Heritage Trust, and because of your speaker Paula Ware's phenomenal finds in the last few years, we said, right, we've got to make sure they stay local, and so we set up to create a museum that in particular would be able to display all the remarkable Iron Age finds of the last few years, but all the other notable stuff we've got from in and around Pocklington as well. That coincided in 2017 with East Riding Council offering Burnby Hall, the building, to Burnby Hall Gardens, the Gardens Trust, as a community asset transfer, and then they offered us some space within the building. Frustratingly and unfortunately, we've been in Yorkshire's slowest queue for 5 years, while East Riding and Burnby Hall Gardens negotiated and got slower and slower and slower. And then last November, the Gardens decided they didn't want the building as a community asset transfer. And that was about the time that I'd been asked to give an update on what's happening with the museum to the High Wolds group. So I thought, right, well, I either have to pull it or pull a rabbit out the hat for that and produce a talk. So it was quite an eclectic bits and pieces about some of the other things that had happened in and around Pocklington of archaeological repute, and Alison heard it at Thixondale and thought it was wonderful. I thought it was a bit of a hodgepodge of everything just chucked into a hat. So she asked me to speak today. I don't go looking for speaking engagements, but I don't say no when I'm asked. And particularly, I can't say no if I'm asked to come to talk at Wetwang, because us Gilbanks is Fridaythope. That's my great-grandfather with his sheep at Wetwang in about 1920, and the little guy there is with a floppy hat on as my dad. And Gilbanks for about 150 years. We lived in the cottage that was down the passage next door to the Victoria Inn. It's intriguing how housing has changed a bit. It's now been knocked into one property. There used to be two down there, and about 140 years ago, there were 11 Gilbanks living in, there's probably about 2 or 3 people living in twice the size now of what 11 of them lived in the 1880s and 1890s. So, like I say, I couldn't turn down an opportunity to come back to Wetwang, and especially as Samuel Gilbank still lives here. He's over there in the churchyard, so I call in to have a look at him every now and again with the rest of my Gilbank ancestors. But you might say, well, what's that got to do with archaeology? I'll get there eventually. He's my great-grandfather, but his grandfather was John Gilbank the Younger, who was transported with his father, John Gilbank the Elder, to Van Diemen's Land in 1921, and serving, 1821, because they got 7 years for poaching. You might think that's a bit harsh, but for John Gilbank the Elder, that was his second offence. In fact, he was awaiting trial for his third poaching offence when he died. But in addition, it was probably what they called an aggravated offence, because they were apprehended by a couple of gamekeepers, and it ended up Gilbank's 2, gamekeepers 0. And so they got shipped off to Van Diemen's Land, did their 7 years out there, and there was no contest. They hopped on the first boat coming back to Wetwang and came back here, and in my 3 times great-grandfather's case, lived just about happily ever after. And so, you're asking me, what's that got to do with archaeology? Well, John Gilbank the Younger dug with Fimber's most famous man, John Robert Mortimer. I can't say he was necessarily that he inspired Mortimer to, because Mortimer's first love was astronomy, and then in midlife he changed from astronomy to archaeology. I don't think my ancestor inspired him. However, John Gilbank was digging barrows before Mortimer was born, and so he did have an effect on him, and I can read that to you in Mortimer's own words. At the commencement of my barrow digging, one of the labourers, John Gilbank of Wetwang, told me that when he was a boy, he was engaged by Mr. R. Holtby of Haywold near Huggett as a yearly servant, and he remembers assisting to cart away some barrows and spread them on the land. In doing this, the iron tyres of 2 wheels and many bones were found in one of them, all of which were carted away with the soil. What I haven't worked out is whether or not my zeal for saving the Pocklington chariots for a museum in Pocklington is because the spirit of John Gilbank lives on in me, or whether or not I'm on a massive guilt trip because not only was he one of the first barrow diggers, he was one of the first chariot destroyers. So I will see where I go with that as we progress. So that might be something to do with archaeology. Like I say, I had to pull together a bit of a hodgepodge to talk to the High Wolds group because there wasn't an update on the museum. And so sometimes, rather than talk about a whole subject, you're as well just pulling a few bits and pieces out and getting a hook to hang things on. And so what I decided is I would create 3 hooks, one about axes, one about coins, and one about DNA and isotopes. So, axes. One of the things that stunned me fairly recently is that I'd always got my head around the fact that we, in Pocklington, you could just about trace the continuous settlement back for about 10,000 years. And 10,000 years ago, East Yorkshire was quite a cosmopolitan place. You could walk from Ireland to Denmark. You needed a pair of wellies to get across Doggerland, but you could just about walk the whole way. And so the trails around here and those ancient routeways went a very long way. But my perspective was about 10,000 years. And then Peter Halkin told me about how in a potato field at Pocklington they'd found a Paleolithic hand axe that had been used for when Neanderthals were killing big elephants and butchering those. And there aren't a lot of them around, but there's quite a notable one in the Hull Museum there that was found at Hotham. There's one in the Southburn Museum from Hutton Cranswick, and there was another one found at Hotham. At Cottam. And that opens up a massive door to go way, way back to the best part of 250,000 to a million years ago and beyond. And things like that are still coming up out of the ground. But going back to my 10,000 years ago, they're few and far between our Mesolithic axes, because it looks as though, the Mesolithic people were hunter-gatherers, so they didn't necessarily clear many forests and chop many trees down. We're hoping that, again, a local farmer picked this up out of his fields on the boundary between Numburnham and Pocklington, and I'm hoping, although it might be a bit forlorn, that it might come back as being identified as a Mesolithic flint axe. Like I say, they're few and far between. It's with Terry Manby at Market Wheaton at the moment, who is the guru on stone and flint. He must be in here, is he? He's about 90, but he's still quite active identifying axes and flints, and he was the person who identified the Pocklington Paleolithic flint hand axe. But I'm fingers crossed that this might come back as Mesolithic. I suspect he might say it's Neolithic as well, in which case we've got, and I couldn't find what I decided I would have to do to give you guys some value is not just give you the Thixondale talk. I thought I'd better sex it up a bit and bung in some Fimber and Fridaythope and Wetwang stuff. I couldn't find a Mesolithic axe from any of your FFWs. However, I did come across this online. Intriguingly, they can't spell Fimber, but if you won't probably be able to read that, but it says, this was for sale for 100 quid on eBay. Set of 10 British Mesolithic flint blades and cutters from Fimber, North Yorkshire, England. Found in fields at Fimber near Wetwang, North Yorkshire. So they can't spell Fimber, and they don't know it's in East Yorkshire. But those are Mesolithic blades that are local to you guys. But stone axes, there's any amount of them. And we actually, just a couple of weeks ago, acquired a load of Neolithic stone axes from Hayton. There was a farmer there who, unfortunately, he and his wife died within 18 months of each other, and their daughter was clearing the farmhouse, and she found a box of stone axes up in the roof space, and she's raising money because both her parents died of cancer, and so we've made a donation to cancer charity and acquired these. This broken one, Peter Halcombe tells me that that's Wolds flint. It's obviously been ploughed into two, and he reckons that one's from a Cumbrian one from Langdale, and that's likely to be from North Wales. So help yourself to have a go up at them afterwards. Don't take them away with you. There was also within there a real nice late Bronze Age hammer axe as well. So where did I put my clicker? Or was it in my pocket?
It's in the box.
Alright, okay. And they abound. I mean, I'm aware of there being at least 20 have been found in and around Pocklington. Most of them have disappeared. Woolgate School had one for decades, but they can't find it now. So that's an axe that was found at Pocklington. That one's from Huggett. That's from Fimber. And those are my collection I've just showed you from Hayton. And that's what they were used for, because obviously in the Neolithic period, that's when the first farmers came along and started clearing. As you will know, Wolds means wooded. And so that's a lot of trees to chop down to turn what was once a massive prehistoric forest into the landscape we've got today. And I've said there's loads of them around. Unsurprisingly, you will find hundreds of stone axes from Wetwang, Fimber and Fridaythope in museums all over the country, including the British Museum, Yorkshire Museum at York, and the Hull and East Riding Museum, which is hardly surprising because the two Mortimer brothers were heavily advertising for give us your axes and your arrows in the 1860s. And if you can still walk across farm fields today and pick up flints and axes like those, and I'm told that they came a few years ago off, there was somebody who had a bit of an interest in history, was on the potato machine. And as you may know, you sit on a potato machine and it's basically a conveyor belt that potatoes keep going past, and every now and again you get a clod of soil or half a brick or bits of stone, and you just chuck those off and let the potatoes keep going. And the guy who was sat on the back of the potato machine just collected all of those and just dropped them at his feet as they were going past. So if you want to find out, Andrew and I have had great success in talking to local farmers who happen to have a museum in their front room or in their kitchen drawer, and they won't go near an archaeologist or a history professional because either it's happened to them or it's happened to previous generations, that things get borrowed and never come back, or they go out of the district to some regional place. But we've been offered all sorts of stuff that, as long as we're local, or as long as we just want to do temporary displays, there's literally thousands of pieces that have been offered for us to display if and when we get our museum going. But there will still be loads of stuff out there in the fields around here. What Mortimer actually said was that he was going to pay for any arrowheads or stone and flint axes from, I think it was within 10 miles, within 10 miles of Fimber, where he lived. And so if that's 160 years ago, there would have been masses and masses of stuff out in the fields. And I just picked out flint axes, not stone ones, but there's one from, you can see there, it says Fridaythope on it, one from Fridaythope, one from Fimber, and one from Wetwang. Moving on to the next age, to the Bronze Age, and this, we're told, is Bronze Age, but thank you to my associate here with Andrew Sefton. These are two axes that he owns. That one there in the middle is from Wetwang. That is in his display box there. I was critical of historical professionals. That's part of a hoard of Bronze Age socketed axes that were found next to the cricket pavilion at Pocklington School in the 1970s. And because there wasn't a local museum, they went to the Yorkshire Museum. And in 2019, Andrew works there as a volunteer, but we did a pop-up museum in 2019, and we asked if they've never been on display. They'll be in a box, probably in a warehouse somewhere. We asked if we could display them, and the answer we got is that they would need 6 months' notice. We'd have to pay for somebody to come out and case the joint where we were going to display them, and then we'd have to pay for somebody to bring them on the night and be there and take them away afterwards. So we didn't pursue that, and sent a rather waspish reply to say, well, that's fine, we've got better stuff than you've got anyway. Like that. But anyway, again, you can have a look at the end. Whoops, sorry. That's your Wetwang axe that in the middle there. They're a lot more common, are the socketed axes like that. I'm skipping the Iron Age and Roman. They're few and far between, and they're not very interesting. But I thought, well, I better not miss them out completely. These are both miniatures. I can't find full-sized used one. When I questioned Peter about that, he said, well, that's probably because they were probably melted down and recast and used for generations. But you just don't seem to get Iron Age or Roman axes coming out the ground. But those are both burial miniatures from Hayton and from Dunburnham. But then you get on to the Vikings, and as you would expect, I mean, Andrew's got two local Viking axes here. One from Fangfoss. That's Andrew when he gets dressed up doing his Viking reenactor. And then that one is from Dunnington as well. I thought that the Vikings had passed a lot of this area by. I couldn't really make a lot of sense that everywhere has got Viking names to them. In Pocklington, which is obviously a Saxon foundation, there's a dozen villages with thorp or by all around it, and that made perfect sense to me when you've got that King Halfdan was supposed to say to his men, he gave out the land and off you go and farm it. Then it seemed to make sense to me that you're in Pocklington and you go out to all the villages. But none of that appeared in any literature that I've come across until this book was published in, I think it was 2020, might have been 2021. No, 2021. The Viking Great Army and the Making of England, written by two professors of archaeology from York University, Don Hadley and Julian Richards. And, got that bit. That'll come in a little bit later about them and where they are and how they've put Viking East Yorkshire into the bigger picture of things. But going on to my next era, we're into then the late medieval, and rather than axes, they had billocks. And I well remember having been given one of these with my dad to go and do a bit of hedging, and that was in the 1960s. Everybody now has one mounted on the back of the tractor if they want to trim a hedge, but you'll still find a load of these hanging around in farmyards. Well, for 500 years they were both the chosen farm implement, but they were also the chosen battle axe as well. That's a picture of Towton with a few Yorkshire billocks there. It's reckoned, Towton is the battle where more Englishmen died than any other battle in history. It's reckoned more men were killed by a billhook than ever were by arrows. We see the medieval period as the British longbow being that what made us the conquerors of Europe, but it was the billhook that most of them chopped the enemy down. I've got a reference that the Lord of the Manor of Pocklington, Thomas Bishop, and his son Thomas Bishop the Younger, they took part in the revolt of the Northern Earls in 1569, which was an attempt to put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne instead of Elizabeth. They failed miserably, but Thomas Bishop the Elder had his skull cleaved open with a bill, and Elizabeth sent her head surgeon up from London to Carlisle to keep him alive, so that they could start to get information about him, about people higher up the chain. So from anywhere from Norman times right up to the present day, the billhook was Yorkshire's most important axe. That's your bit about axes. Going on then to pots was the other peg I decided to hang some stuff on, and that's Mortimer's collection when it was on display in Driffield, and that's Mortimer's collection in the Hull and East Riding Museum now. It doesn't do a lot for me, that. To me, it's a bit gloomy. You get overwhelmed by the quantity and don't really see much quality on that. So was disappointed when I went and had a look at Mortimer's bronze beakers, and I came across on the internet a book of illustrations, and I thought that actually did more for me with the variety of the different pots that had been collected out of the barrows on the Wolds than that display did. Where, I went bog-eyed many years ago looking at a computer screen trying to find out history stuff, but I could have gone again just trying to look through all of those. And so I thought that was a bit special. I found that online in a book. It was a book published in America with that. And then, as well, that to me says far more than the museum display. That's one of your Fimber Bronze Age beakers as a diagram. And I think that's incredible for the amount of detail and care that's gone into a handmade pot. I was talking a bit earlier about maybe Mortimer was inspired by my 3 times great-grandfather. Well, I think he was a bit low down the chain. We were a family of farm labourers and shepherds, and they spread out a bit. I do remember my first ever trip to Fridaythope, because my grandfather's sister and her husband had Manor Farm on the corner at Fridaythope, where there's Back Lane and the A166. The first time I ever went to Fridaythope, my dad would have been in big trouble these days. His auntie wanted a load of straw, and we had an XWD old army lorry, so he piled it up with straw bales about 40 foot high, and then took one bale out on the top. I was 6, and he sat me in this little home cockpit on the top of the set of bales, and set off from Pocklington to Fridaythope with me sat in there. I don't remember a lot about the journey. I do remember when I got there, my great-aunt took me into the kitchen at Manor Farm, classic farm kitchen with a big Yorkie range there, and sat me down in this chair, and there was a massive pig laid on the mat in front of the fire. And I have heard the legend of the Fridaythope pig does get passed on a bit in local history circles. Well, it's completely true. My dad said that his aunt used to think more of the pig than she did of her husband, and it got better looked after as well. But I was given a drink and sat next to this snoring pig in front of the fire. However, while the Gilbanks didn't necessarily inspire Mortimer, James Silburn did. And he was one of the early barrow diggers. He was a butcher from Pocklington, and he started digging in the 1840s. Mortimer didn't begin his work until the 1860s, and he excavated those pots from water. That's the water one, I think. That's Blanche, and that's Huggett. You have to beware. I mean, you guys are amateur archaeologists. Make sure you wrap up, because James Silburn was 26 and he was digging a barrow on Wolds, and he caught a chill that developed into pneumonia, and he died a couple of weeks later at the age of 26. So next time you're out in winter digging, then make sure you put an hat on and a kite. He used to leave little lead tablets with his name on. When we were at school, we used to chalk on the wall. Gilbank was here. Well, Mortimer used to be mortified when he opened a barrow in the 1870s, 1880s, and there was these little lead tablets saying, "Just Silver was here before you." That was, just shoved that in, and when they were expanding the gliding club at Pocklington, they found that Roman funerary pot, and that's the Roman inside him in a plastic bag. When I said we've had, you win some, you lose some. We've lost some iconic pieces that we hoped we could get as part of a museum collection, but we've had some great wins as well. That was remarkable because they found it when they were building the gliding club extension. Somebody took it to Burnley Hall Gardens because it has the Major Stewart Museum. They don't have anything to do with archaeology, but one of the staff at Burnley Hall Gardens' brother worked at Hull University. So he gave it to his brother, who took it to Hull University and gave it to one of the lecturers. And Peter Halkin, a couple of years ago, was a guy in the same building as him, had retired. And Peter was walking past this empty office, and that was on top of the filing cabinet. And so he rescued it. If he hadn't have done, who knows, could have got chucked in a bin or a skip. But like I say, that was from a Roman funeral pyre burial, and we have now got the pot back in Pocklington, and we've got the Roman back in Pocklington as well inside it. Andrew and I were doing a piece with a local school a few months ago, and they were incredibly excited. The most best thing that we had was that, because they wanted to see the Roman inside the pot.
They were all looking inside.
They were all like this, trying to see it. And this was quite a remarkable find on the balk on the building site to the right-hand side going out. They found a pottery dump, and it was a pit where there were over several thousand broken pots in it, and they reckoned it was over a period of going on for 500 years. And within it was just about all the pieces of a butt beaker, about this size, but this shape. And I've been a bit disparaging about archaeologists, but there was an archaeologist was the pottery expert on the dig called Ruth Leahy, who identified that butt beaker as being made round about AD 70, and that it was imported from the south of England. And you don't often get archaeologists to stick their neck out that far, but she surmised that it had been a peace offering from the invading Romans in AD 71 to the local Parisi chieftain. That concerned me a bit because I was reading a magazine a bit later where they'd found a similar peace offering in Leicester. It was a hoard of silver coins and a Roman helmet, but they managed to buy us off in Pocklington with a flaming bit of pottery full of beer. However, it was a nice story that we couldn't let miss, so I do drink my cup of tea in the morning out of the Pocklington Parisi pot. If you want to do the same, we do sell them at 12 quid a time. That's the same shape, but that's the Triskelly from the Pocklington shield that is covered in interwoven, interlocking Triskellies all the way. So if you do go to Malton, that's what you're going to be looking at. There's a picture of it in there. But we hopefully will get it. I'm hoping I can get it made up and get that retrieved as well. But of all the pots, and especially all these bronze beaker pots, the most famous one in the 21st century is the Wetwang slap beaker. And you will all know more than I do about the beaker immigrant studies in 2020. That was a major archaeological post-excavation study that was published across the world, but what it was basically saying is that the immigration into Britain was well before the Iron Age, and that basically the Neolithic men were wiped out by the Bronze Age. But what the academics used, along with their academic detailed paper, was the Wetwang slap beaker. So you are famous across Europe for that piece of research and publication. Moving on to coins. The Vikings, as I said, were passers-by, or so we thought. You know, I quite like the Vikings, but I read this East Yorkshire Local History Society publication from the 1960s, 70s and 80s, because it was obviously very popular and reprinted 3 times. Hardly mentions us at all. But the Viking Great Army and Making of England had taken a very different approach to studying the Viking Age. What they'd looked at is all the metal detector finds on the portable antiquity site and grouped them together and identified the Anglo-Scandinavian or Viking pieces. And out of that, the Great Army, or the Great Heathen Army, or Viking Great Army, it arrived in the Midlands in 1865 and then headed north and captured York in 866, and then went further north again. The Saxons retook York and they came back down again and took York again in 867 and established the Kingdom of Jorvik. But these 2 professors from York University have studied all these groups, and what they reckon is that at Cowland, Cotton, Bainton, Killam, Pocklington, Newmall, Stamford Bridge and Yapham were offshoots of the Viking Great Army. the Viking Great Army was about 5,000 soldiers. Well, that's going to take a lot of feeding, and especially if you're wintering as well. And what they reckon is that they split up into smaller pockets, or they went out as foraging groups, and that they spent significant amounts of time at all of these places because they found things like gaming pieces and all sorts of evidence that they were doing bits of industrial workings. So they just didn't pass through. They were camped there for a significant period of time. And so that, for me, has opened up a whole new window into the Viking Age. And what we're told is that in the 860s, they were conquering, pillaging, murdering, robbing, and taking slaves and selling them. But then in the 1870s was the periods when they started putting down the roots, and they moved. What it says in the book is that they changed from raiders to traders. That was when they started putting the roots down, establishing Viking farmsteads, and for the next 80, 90 years we became the Viking Kingdom of Jorvik. What I really liked about this is the Vikings didn't bother with coins. They did a lot of silver working, but they didn't bother using coins. But that is a Anlaf Raven silver penny of the last. Anlaf was the last Viking king. He was King of Dublin and King of York. And he did have coinage, and that's the Raven. And so that, I thought that's a great, massive, intriguing representation of a Viking raven that was found on a rare coin that was discovered in Pocklington. I say it was a rare coin. It sold a few years ago in America for $13,000, so it must have been fairly rare. Talking about rare coins, a guy called Tony Abramson from Leeds was a collector of coins, but he was also the big #1 expert on early Saxon coinage. And he's getting on a bit, and he decided to sell his collection in 2021. Made nearly £1 million out of selling his collection, because he'd been buying coinage for a lot of years. But within the auction, there were 18 coins from Pocklington, 6 from Fimber, and 10 from Wetwang. And so I just pulled a few out to give you a bit of a taste. That was the one that grabbed my attention most. That's been identified as a very early Paulinus gold shilling. When I first saw it, that's Paulinus there. When I first saw it, I thought, well, he's in cruciform position like that. But then, silly me, that's his eyes, that's his nose, that's his moustache. And I put in, that's a Saxon bishop's carving from down south, just so it illustrates the shape of the face. So that's Paulinus' face, and he's holding a cross in either hand and stood behind the church wall. The reason why that's so intriguing to me is we obviously had in Pocklington what's called the Sotheby Cross, which is a medieval copy that may well have been a replacement from for an earlier Saxon cross, which says Paulinus preached here 627, and Tony Abramson identified that as being of the same period, and his view is that it wouldn't have been used as currency. It will have been something handed over to early Christians as a token of them establishing the church. You could say, well, maybe Toby Emerson would say that because it captured the market's interest, and that was sold for £33,000 in late 2021. Of the other ones in that auction, that's a silver Seat from Fimber. That was a nice little story. I'll read that out to you. Found at Fimber from Quentinvic on the northern French coast, an important trading town established in the 6th century, which had disappeared by the 10th century. It was from here that Franks, Saxons and Frisians traded textiles and wine for wool and slaves, with Saxons from Kent and Hampshire. And it was from Quentinvic that the English set off on early pilgrimages. And so somehow that coin ended up underground in Fimber, and it was dated to early 8th century. So whether that was that they paid for a load of slaves with those coins and shipped them off, or whether somebody had either had come back from a crusade, who knows? But it's a nice piece. Those are again Seats from the 8th and 9th century, both from Fimber. Quite like the horse on that. Can't see what the bits on them, but they've got quite interesting motifs on as well. Those are two from Wetwang, again Saxon Seats, early 8th century, both of them, and again lots of detail. You'll find all this stuff online. You've got a guy there, he's some religious figure carrying a cross, and possibly the most notable local coin. That's a Correlatovi gold stutter from pre-Roman times that was found at Wetwang. One of the latest theories, there's always been this big debate that they didn't make coins in East Yorkshire, but they did find them from the Correlatovi, who were basically from Leicester up to Lincoln. And so one of the theories that came out was that, well, maybe they just traded a few across the Humber. But increasingly, more and more Iron Age hoards are being found in East Yorkshire, all of them from this Midland tribe. And one of the theories that have been put forward recently is, well, maybe the Parisi's East Yorkshire was a junior kingdom of the Correlatovi, where the king of the Correlatovi sent his eldest son to rule East Yorkshire to get a bit of practice in, and then move back down for the main territory. So that's an interesting slant on trying to explain why is it that they had coins south of the Humber that they made, but the coins that were found north of the Humber were all made south of the Humber. my final hook is about DNA and isotopes. There was a massive research program that was published in December 2021 that was comparing migration into Britain in the Bronze Age. I mentioned earlier that the indications were that the major immigration in prehistoric times was during the Bronze Age. Well, this study was done by York University, Vienna University, and by Harvard in America. And skeletons from Wetwang Slack and from Pocklington were all part of the study. There was, from all these places across Britain, they did DNA and isotope testing. One of the challenges for us when we said we would create a museum is that somebody had suggested there was going on for 200 skeletons found down Burnby Lane in the Iron Age cemetery, and somebody had suggested, well, what we ought to do is rebury them. If we took those on, we had to guarantee that they would be curated in such a way that they could be examined for another 25 years. And that makes some sense. You see on television now where people are going to prison for murders that were committed 25 years ago because DNA testing scientifically has moved on so much in that period. And so they found out a remarkable amount of information, but who knows how much the science might advance in the next 10 or 20 years, and that they would need to go back to. All of this stuff those were the places where they compared skeletons from on the continent against skeletons from in Britain. And we were hoping it would finally nail down the debate that are the Parisi in East Yorkshire actually from Paris, where the Celtic tribe were called the Parisii, with two eyes on the end. That's what most people thought, although Peter Halkin chucked an extra theory in where the Old Welsh word for a spear is par, and Old Welsh is the type of language that they spoke in East Yorkshire in the Iron Age, and so we had the choice of where the Parisi chucked out of Paris, sailed up the Seine, round the side of Britain and up the Humber, and turned East Yorkshire into a French colony, or were the Parisi the spiritualists? We were hoping this study would nail that down. Unfortunately, there's good news and bad news. The bad news was there weren't enough skeletons from central France to compare with skeletons from East Yorkshire to nail that completely. The good news was that what they did find is that the East Yorkshire skeletons were significantly different to the rest of England. And so we didn't come from where they came from. What a surprise. We're not like them Southerners. However, it didn't completely nail it down. But it's, you can find that online. It was first published in Nature magazine. It did my head in trying to read it, but I've I've just pulled a few bits out from there. And that was picked up and taken on a bit further. And a couple of months ago, out came this book called Chariots, Swords and Spears, 9 Burials at the Foot of the East Yorkshire Wolds, which is the publication about the Pocklington excavations on the Mile and on Burnley Lane. Because it was such a remarkable excavation, usually there would be a fairly brief paper that gets logged with East Yorkshire Council as the planning authority. It's taken 5 years for this to come out because they said it was so important, the information in it, it had to go straight to publication rather than a summary. But out of that, there's been masses of post-excavation analysis. This guy, Derek Hamilton, is a professor at Glasgow University, and he picked up particularly doing the isotope testing between Pocklington and Wetwang slag and comparing the different some of it, they take tooth enamel, and from that can identify what type of water somebody drank. And so there is a difference between water that we slaked in Pocklington and water that was slaked upon chalk. And out of that, there's been some quite remarkable information that you can try and disseminate from here, although it isn't easy. They took this burial from down Burnley Lane at Pocklington, and he was a guy who was buried lying on his shield, and that's just the metal strip around the edge of the shield. And they reckon that he was born and grew up in Pocklington, that he lived as an adult on the Wolds around Wetwang, and then he returned to Pocklington later in life. There we go. Spent his childhood on Pocklington geology and moved away in his mid-teens, and then returned to Pocklington in the decade prior to death. I mean, that's an incredible amount of information to gather off somebody's tooth enamel, but you know, you've got to be admiring, and it's impressive. This person, again, was found down Burnley Lane. She was raised away from Pocklington and then came to Pocklington within a decade of her death, and they looked at the collagen in her bones, and again, it's all in the book with that. The famous guy on there, the Pocklington charioteer, who was he was the feature of an episode of Digging for Britain, and that's one of our illustrations that we commissioned to see what he looked like. That was what the University of Manchester did as but that was the actual grave. The belief is that he was born in Pocklington, lived the middle of his life at Wetwang, and then returned to Pocklington in older age. Derek Hamilton has also suggested that there are 30 Iron Age chariots being found in Britain, and 28 of them are in East Yorkshire, if you include the bit of the North Yorkshire Moors. You know, that there was a couple up near Scarborough that they hadn't drawn the county boundaries in AD 250, so we counted those in. But there's one being found in Edinburgh, which you'll find in a museum in Edinburgh, and there was one at Ferry Fryston that's the Ferry Fryston chariot in Castleford Museum. That was an experience. Was going to go and see it. That's the only chariot display in Yorkshire, and they've made quite a nice job of that. You know, but it's about 4 foot by 3 foot presentation. Next to it was an even bigger, more impressive presentation of Viv Nicholson, the lady from Castleford who won £100,000 on the pools in the 1960s and became a blonde bombshell spendall, as it were. So it was intriguing to me, looking at something that I thought was iconic, but to the people of Castleford, not as important as the full timeline, life story of 6 foot high of Viv Nicholson there. But Derek Hamilton is saying that he thinks that the Ferry Fryston charioteer spent time on the Wolds near Wetwang, but was predominantly from Pocklington, but died and was buried at Ferry Fryston. So, if he's right, that makes a lot of sense, because then you've only got, of the 30 chariots that they found, we've only got one outside East Yorkshire, because this fellow was on his holidays when he pegged it, unfortunately. But the bad news for you guys as well is that in the book it says that one of the Wetwang women charioteers, the one who was buried with a beam tin alongside her, that she was born and brought up in Pocklington and then came to Wetwang. So, sorry about that, but that's what Derek Hamilton says in the book. Those are the illustrations from Mel Giles's. Have you had Mel Giles too? She's a good lass. She lives in Sheffield, but she's a lecturer of archaeology at Manchester. Does a lot in East Yorkshire. That's a good book. So, you're in future you're going to have to share Wetwang woman with her, and we'll have to share a bit of the Pocklington charioteer with you guys. You'll all have heard of the Wetwang Garden Slack project that was produced by Ian Armitt in 2021. Ian Armitt's the Professor of Archaeology at York University, and what they did was get a wodge of money from the lottery that Brewster's and Dent's digs at Garden and Wetwang in the 60s, 70s and 80s were very carefully excavated and were recorded, but were never published. And so Ian Armitt got paid a fortune to pull all this work together and look at it through new eyes and do some further research and analysis, and that was published in 2021. And so that was basically taking the Wetwang and Garden Slack book, reopening it, and adding a few extra chapters that were quite revealing. Going back to my roots, I told you about my great-grandfather living over there in the churchyard. Round the corner from him in Wetwang Churchyard is one of my favourite people from history, Edward Maule Cole, because he's buried round the corner. And in the 1890s, he wrote from Huggett Dykes Run Earthworks, two on the southern side of the Dale to Millington and one on the northern side. Of the two on the southern side, one continues all the way down the hill to Pocklington. Well, this is one of Peter Halken's more recent aerial photos, and you can just see there is a triple bank nearly ploughed out and trenchment just marked, and then this is an Iron Age routeway. They've done some more detailed archaeology on some of the roads coming down to Pocklington from the Wolds. We all look at the Romans as the great road builders, but they found chalk roads from the Wolds down to Pocklington, and they've identified the tracks that the chariots made, channels. It's all right, Andrew. That's your big billow. They've identified the channels down the side that the metal wheels made on the routeways from the Wolds down to the Vale of York. And I see the Iron Age Celts around here very much in similar ways maybe to the Maasai in Africa, where they herded cattle and they needed enormous amounts of water and they needed enormous amounts of pasture. Well, Millington Springs is the big place for water in the whole of the Wolds. As you will know, on the central Wolds there's no running water. You have to make ponds, but in summer that would dry out. That's why they had the famous Battle of Fridaythope. But you would have to move your herds around. And so it doesn't, and it also looks, again, similar to the Maasai, that they may be their cattle, they didn't eat them as much as bled them and milked them. So they weren't beef farmers, they were dairy farmers, and a bit of blood on the side. And so Maule Cole was saying that he could trace the earthworks from Huggett Dykes all the way down to Pocklington. You still can, because in September I walked them as part of East Riding Walking Festival. Sue Dale from Huggett came on the first bit, and then we got some uphill bit stuff, so she turned around and went home to make dinner. But we followed the earthworks all the way down to Pocklington, and obviously, as you would know, going in the other direction, you can follow the earthworks that go all the way from Wetwang to Garden along Warrendale with that. And so that's, you're pushing 20 miles at that. And so in the Iron Age, it isn't just a bit of a trackway. You've got, certainly a B road, maybe even an A road, going all the way from Wetwang to Pocklington. And I started out this talk about how my family migrated from Wetwang to Pocklington in the 20th century, and obviously that's nothing new, because Wetwang to Pocklington is clearly a well-trodden path, as you've heard from the Pocklington chariot man and the Wetwang chariot woman. They were moving backwards and forwards, and if I go back to Ian Armitt, we had a book launch for this in last month, and that is Ian Armitt talking about how they're still on with doing new, very technical DNA and isotope investigations on the old skeletons from Wetwang and from Garden. And what he gave us just a little insight into some of the findings, and he said they've identified 7 generations of Wetwang people within the cemetery. And you'll have to get Ian to update it, because this is just, like I say, a bit of a snippet, and it's just the stuff just coming out. But what he said as well is what it looks like is it was the women that stayed around here, and the men came and went within that. What he also told us was that while there might have been some skipped generations, it might have been a great-grandmother, but they identified skeletons from Pocklington who had ancestors from the 7 generations in Wetwang. So you're almost starting to do family trees then out of it. I think it's a bit more technical than what's this local, the latest program they do on telly, DNA, whatever it is. You know, it's a bit more technical than that, but it was intriguing for me that we could identify, like I say, 7 generations in Wetwang, and then you go down 3 or 4 generations, and suddenly there's a string of generations in Pocklington as well. So that's me talking about bits and pieces from axes, coins and isotopes, and a bit chipped in about Gilbank's free Wetwang. Thank you.